Welcome to another Pandemic Baseball Book Club conversation. My name is Ethelbert Miller, and today I will be talking with Bryan Soderholm-Difatte. He has written several books about the history of baseball. Two were published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2021. Those titles are The Reshaping of America's Game, Major League Baseball After the Players' Strike, and America's Game in the Wild Card Era from Strike to Pandemic. Those two books follow two other books that Bryan has written, and those titles are America's Game, A History of Major League Baseball Through World War II, and Tumultuous Times in America's Game, From Jackie Robinson's Breakthrough to the War Over Free Agency. So Bryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Okay, a lot to talk about in the next 35 minutes. In America's Game, in the Wild Card Era, you talk about paradigm shifts in that book. I think many of us would probably agree that since the pandemic, we have seen a paradigm shift around the entire world. So let's begin by talking about paradigm shift in regards to baseball. And let's begin by talking about Theo Epstein, a man responsible for the Boston Red Sox and Chicago Cubs winning the World Series. How has Epstein changed baseball, and what magic did he bring to Boston and Chicago?
Well, I think one important name to begin with is Billy Beane, architect of the Oakland Athletics, who from the year 2000 to 2004, despite having just 1/3 the salary of the New York Yankees, had the second best record in all of Major League Baseball with his Moneyball concept, second only to the New York Yankees. Now, during this time, it's not as though Billy Beane was the only executive whose operations were relying on computer analytics. There were others as well. And one of them was a young guy who was with the San Diego Padres named Theo Epstein. Now, ironically, as we know from the movie with Brad Pitt, the way the movie ends, he gets an offer from the Boston Red Sox to come over and run their team. He turned that down. That happened in real life too. And once he turned it down, the Red Sox then went to Theo Epstein, who was only 28 years old at about that time, about to turn 29. Now, the thing about the Red Sox was when he was hired to run their baseball operations, to be, in effect, the general manager, they had finished second in the American League East to the almighty Yankees 5 years in a row. This was a team that actually had a pretty solid core of veterans. They were just missing that little extra something that could conceivably take down the New York Yankees. So 2003 was the first full year of the Theo Epstein regime in Boston. And one of the first things he did was go on the free agent market and sign 3 relatively unknown players. One of them was a 37-year-old pitcher with 12 years of experience and roughly about 650 games named Mike Timlin. Not a great pitcher by any means, but also not a complete unknown. Another was a third baseman, 7-year veteran by the name of Bill Muller. A good ball player, not a standout ball player. And the third guy was a fellow by the name of David Ortiz, who had just been released by the Minnesota Twins after having failing over the course of 2 or 3 years to demonstrate that, from Minnesota's perspective at least, he had a future in Major League Baseball. These 3 players would be instrumental to the success that the Red Sox would have under Theo Epstein in the years ahead. Now, we all know what happened in 2003, once again finishing second to the Yankees in the AL East, and then that dramatic 7th game of the American League Championship Series that ended with Aaron Boone taking a Tim Wakefield knuckleball, presumably, into the left field seats, and back to the World Series go the Yankees, and Theo Epstein is left to figure out what to do next. What he did next was to make a very strong pitch for Curt Schilling, who we all remember teamed up with Randy Johnson in 2001 to form one of the most formidable 1-2 pitching punches there ever was. And they beat the Arizona, and that was the Arizona Diamondbacks beating the New York Yankees in the World Series. Now it was Schilling coming to Boston, pairing with Pedro Martinez, and they did exactly the same thing. And of course, the miracle that occurred in 2004 was ending 86 years of a championship drought in Boston. And the way they did it was, I mean, the stuff of, storybook endings, trailing the New York Yankees by 3-0 in the American League Championship Series. No team in Major League history ever coming back from that kind of a deficit in a 7-game World Series. They won the next 4 to win the pennant. And as if that wasn't enough, they then swept the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series to win their first championship since 1918. And then finally, 3 years later, in 2007, Theo Epstein and the Red Sox finished ahead of the New York Yankees for the first time in who knows how many years. And then once again, they went on to win the World Series.
And then he leaves Boston and goes to Chicago.
That's right. The circumstances under which he left Boston are kind of interesting. He left of his own volition, but that was after the Red Sox had blown what was essentially a 9.5-game lead going into September over the wild card team to finish out of the running for the playoffs in 2011. After that, he goes over to Chicago, who had their own bad history of not having won a championship since way back in 1908, which at this point was 103 years before that. And also of significance, they had not even been to the World Series since the end of World War II, 1945. And what Epstein did with the Cubs has since euphemistically become known as tanking. The Cubs had the 3rd highest payroll in the National League each of the 2 previous seasons, and had finished 5th in the NL Central Division, 5 out of 6 teams. So despite that payroll, they were going absolutely nowhere. What Theo Epstein decided to do was to sacrifice the immediate future by making the Chicago Cubs the worst possible team in the major leagues, if that proved necessary, for the purpose of building a winner, hopefully by the middle to late 20-teens. And the idea being, of course, that the lower you finish in the standings relative to all other major league teams, the higher the draft pick you.
Let's link that to another sport. Let's link that to basketball, where you see teams like deliberately like trying to lose. And if you're a season ticket holder, you're like upset. You say, okay, I brought these tickets and you guys have no intention of winning.
Well, that's right. And that's why I think that kind of a philosophy isn't going to work everywhere. Now, perhaps in Chicago, which is, let's face it, it's not a small market city, and they love their sports as much as Boston or New York or any place else does. But I think in the case of the Cubs, they have such a long-standing legacy of being lovable losers.
Right.
You want to throw in the lovable part there, that people were willing to do that.
Right.
Now, what Epstein did was the Cubs finished with the worst record in their division each of the first 3 years he was there, but he was meticulously building up a very solid core of prospects in the Cubs farm system. Some of them through their own draft picks, like Chris Bryant, for example, Javi Baez, he was there actually before he took over, but Kyle Schwarber was another. And in addition to that, they had Gleyber Torres, who they signed on the international market. He's from Venezuela. And the Cubs also were going after other teams' top prospects. So in 2012, they brought on board Anthony Rizzo from the San Diego Padres. Well,
let's put the prospects aside and look at a major decision. And you were talking about tanking, but let's bring in the name Joe Madden.
Right.
Tampa Bay, because evidently Theo said, okay, we're going to pay you a lot of money to come north. And it seems as if the Tampa Bay team, who was operating under a low payroll, and seemed like, they didn't want to put money at certain time and winning with a low price. But if you're saying, okay, we need a missing piece, and the missing piece is the manager, then it gets into how much you want to pay a manager who, is not out there on the field. And it seems if when you bring in Madden, he has already brought into analytics and things of that sort. So it seems like there's a nice marriage there with Epstein.
Absolutely. And that's a very, very important point, because it was in 2015 that Theo Epstein kind of decided, I'm getting set to go for it now. And that was the year that Bryant and Baez were called up to be start regulars on the Chicago Cubs. But that was also the year he lured Joe Madden away from the Tampa Bay Rays. And you're exactly right in terms of what you were saying about Madden being very inclined towards analytics. This, despite the fact that he was basically kind of an old tooth, as it were, in terms of his age and his baseball experience. But he was very flexible. He understood the direction that the game was going. And in fact, as a manager, using data analytics, he was extraordinarily creative. It was really Joe Madden that kind of institutionalized the concept of defensive shifts being more than just the occasional thing you did if you had a power hitter like, well, back in my day, Harmon Killebrew coming up or something like that, where virtually so many players now, whether they're power hitters or not, can't wind up coming to bat with a shift against them, because Madden and the Rays had basically taken a look at what the hitting tendencies were of every hitter they would face. And it doesn't matter whether you're a power hitter or a slap hitter. Right. Every hitter has certain places that they're going to tend more than others to hit the ball, and they would position themselves in that way. So Madden was, I think, a stroke of genius in terms of Epstein being able to lure him away from the Tampa Bay Rays. Mm-hmm. And coincidentally, his very first year with the Cubs, the Chicago Cubs had the third best record in Major League Baseball. And ironically, all they qualified for was the second wild card in the National League, because all three of the teams with the best record in Major League Baseball just happened to be in the NL Central. And then, as we remember, you had Jake Arrieta outpitching Garrett Cole of the Pittsburgh Pirates in the wild card game. Then the Cubs took down the first place St. Louis Cardinals to advance to the League Championship Series, where unfortunately for them, it was the Mets' turn in 2015, not the Cubs. Mm-hmm. So what Theo Epstein then did was say, okay, I need a little bit more veteran talent here. Mm-hmm. And so he signed as free agents outfielder Jason Hayward, was key pitcher John Lister, right, and also pitcher John Lackey. Right. And 2016, the rest is
Hayward was key because he had that little rain delay. If I'm not mistaken, some of the guys were crying in the dugout, and he brought his sort of, senior positioning and said, look, we can still win this.
That's right. And that rain delay occurred after Aroldis Chapman, who was their closer, had blown the lead, giving up a dramatic home run. Mm-hmm. And that's another point I think that's important to make, is that even though the Cubs had been in first place since the third or fourth game of the 2016 season and were running away with their division, Theo Epstein understood that if we have any weakness on this team, it's in our bullpen. And so he traded one of his team's top prospects, Gleyber Torres, to the Yankees for Aroldis Chapman, even though he knew that Chapman was a free agent at the end of the year and was almost certainly going to be probably signing back with the Yankees, which is what he did. Right. But it worked. It helped get them a championship.
Well, let's move from teams and players and managers and talk about the baseball commissioner. How does the baseball commissioner shape baseball direction? Discuss relationship between the owners and the commissioner.
Well, on that second question, the commissioner has always ostensibly answered to the owners. Right. I guess there would be really two exceptions to that rule, and they're not totally exceptions, but I'm going to call them exceptions. The first was with the first commissioner, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who, as we all recall, was asked by the owners to take over the game after the Black Sox scandal. of throwing the World Series in 1919. And his condition, he's a federal judge, remember, his condition for taking the job was, I'm the boss. You guys don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do.
I'm my own Supreme Court.
That's right. Commissioners since then, up until Bud Selig, in the 1992-93 time period, basically answered to the owners. So, you know,
And Bud was an owner at one time.
He was in fact an owner, the owner of the Milwaukee Brewers, and he engineered a coup, as it were, getting rid of Fay Vincent as commissioner in 1991-1992 timeframe, at the time when the owners and the players were heading towards a major confrontation that in fact did involve the players' strike, or did provoke the players' strike of 1994 and 1995. Selig was acting commissioner at this time. It wasn't until 1996 or 97 that he actually became full-time commissioner. And again, his idea was kind of, I want to consolidate all authority of Major League Baseball in the office of the commissioner. So that's one reason why you no longer have a president of the American League and the president of the National League, or for that matter, American League umpires and National League umpires. It's all the major leagues. And Selig's power grab can essentially be said to be kind of the greatest power grab by anyone in Major League Baseball since Judge Landis himself back in the 1920s.
Well, let's look at the strength of the commissioner and, you know, begin to talk about the players union, how they organize. But looking at the players union in the context of what has happened during this time that we had the baseball strike, we have a number of major strikes in which people seem to be controlling their workspace, whether it's U.S. Postal Service or air traffic controllers. People are really concerned. So now you see baseball players being no exception, you know, concerned about working conditions. How does that play out in terms of, you know, players striking, but because people are somewhat sympathetic to workers, you know, they can tolerate it, even though people are upset that, okay, we're not going to have a World Series this year?
That players' strike turned out to be kind of a pox on both their houses, where a lot of fans were very upset and very angry at the players for going on strike, wondering, you know, saying, you know, you guys are paid really, really well.
Right.
Why would you do that? But they were equally upset with the owners for basically being hard locked in their position and not giving ground on anything whatsoever. That was part of Selig's.
Let me interrupt you there, because we're, you know, we hear from the fans, oh, they're making a lot of money, and you know, they should just, you know, like what one of them said to LeBron James, just shut up and dribble. But we know that if we look at some of the issues, okay, which would affect every worker, like say we're school teachers, if you now deal with an issue like testing for steroids or whatever, which is pretty much an invasion of one's privacy on one level, that you would say, okay, that and being able to be free, those are concerns that any worker should be sympathetic to. It affects everybody, even regardless of how much you're making. That's what I'm trying to emphasize.
Well, that's true. The interesting thing about when you mentioned the drugs, steroids in particular, performance-enhancing drugs, it was in fact the union's position of opposition to testing in steroids, for steroids, that the Commissioner Selig was able to actually leverage to use against the union to kind of back them off into a corner on other issues involving basically player relations, and specifically the union backing down on issues such as revenue sharing or the luxury tax, which is just another nice way of saying salary cap.
Right.
Even though it was set up sufficiently high in the beginning that in all of history, I think only 8 of the 30 franchises have ever actually exceeded the salary cap. But that particular position taken by the players' union in defense of the players' privacy was something that Selig was able to kind of turn against them in negotiations for successive collective bargaining agreements since the beginning of the 2000s.
Well, let's look at the situation, bring it up to date, and look at Commissioner Rob Manfred and how he has to make decisions regarding COVID, when to bring the games back, the conditions. How does he manage to navigate through that?
I think he did probably the only thing with regard to the 2020 season, which, as you recall, did not begin until the end of July of last year, and was basically amounted to a 2-month season. And then they had different rules in effect, both for the playing of games themselves, many of which were still in effect this year, such as 7-inning doubleheaders, 7-inning games and doubleheaders, or starting extra innings, each extra innings with a runner already at second base. My view would be that he probably did all that he could. It would have been unreasonable, given how much uncertainty there was at the time of what was going on with the spread of the COVID pandemic in the United States, to try to proceed with the major league schedule as it was. And if I recall correctly, it might have been the NBA that was the first professional sport that's shut down. Okay. And I think MLB then, like within a day, followed suit.
Oh. Let's look at going back to how you present in your book, America's Game in the Wild Card Era, and this paradigm sort of shift. Talk about, and you made reference in your comments to the Black Sox scandal. Talk about the Houston Astros scandal of 2017 and the importance of that scandal, how the commissioner responded, since, it seemed like a few people were just maybe not even really suspended, but not fined or anything. But it seemed as if that was a major scandal. And perhaps because baseball was interrupted with COVID, we didn't really see the fans responding to when, say, the Astros came to their city.
Well, obviously in 2020, they couldn't respond at all because the entire season
right, exactly.
was played with nobody in the stands.
And they were happy about that.
So the Houston Astros caught a break,
right?
if you want to call it
somebody was beating the can for them.
Yeah, I think the big controversy of how the commissioner handled that was that he only held management responsible for what was happening, even though this turned out to have been a player-driven initiative. I think part of it was after that article first ran in, I believe it was The Athletic.
Athletic, right.
Yeah, it was an article in The Athletic. Pitcher named Fires, whose first name I can't remember right now. He had been with Houston in 2017, and he's the one who kind of leaked the sordid details. Exactly. And the commissioner then launched the investigation with regard to that. And my understanding is that to get players' cooperation, he kind of promised, don't worry, nobody, you guys aren't going, this isn't going to fall on you in terms of what happens. It did fall on the general manager of the Houston Astros and the manager of the Houston Astros, and then ultimately on one of their coaches, Alex Cora, who, as you know, was already managing the Boston Red Sox.
And then the other person was Beltran.
Yes, Carlos Beltran, who was a player at the time and was not punished, but obviously, and he had just been named manager of the New York Mets. He had not ever managed a single game yet, and within a month or so of being named manager of the New York Mets, I think the Mets and he together, probably with the Mets kind of doing some pushing, came to the conclusion that this was not the appropriate time for him to begin his managerial career. But no players themselves were, in fact, sanctioned by the commissioner's office for what happened, even though some of them actually kind of admitted to having participated in the scheme.
Right. Well, let's connect that scandal to maybe what we call maybe a mini scandal, in terms of we're curious of whether pitchers were cheating, using substance on the ball. So all of a sudden now, after an inning, you have to almost undress to the umpire checks your glove, your hat, and things of that sort. I mean, how much is that necessary? I mean, when you look at it in terms of not beating on cans, but in almost every sport, players bend the rules. I mean, we go back to, there was a spitball at one time,
Yeah.
How do you feel in terms of how that's been handled?
With regard to the pitching,
pitching and trying to
spider tag, I guess, is the specific thing
Right.
that they're talking about to get a better grip on
exactly, and not using anything that foreign substance that would be, illegal.
right. It's sort of interesting to me. It's kind of like you're drawing a fine distinction here between cheating and then like other kinds of cheating.
Brian,
for example,
Brian, before you go on, explain what you just said.
Right. It's sort of like Gaylord Perry, who's in the Hall of Fame,
Right.
Terrific pitcher.
Right.
He was widely assumed to be throwing the spitball when he was active.
Mm-hmm.
He never denied that he was. He even wrote an autobiography basically saying, yes, I threw the spitball, after which he's elected to the Hall of Fame anyway. So it sort of is like, I think that spitballs, while technically illegal, are kind of accepted as that's okay in the spirit of gamesmanship, provided you can get away with it. If you don't
Right.
get caught on the diamond, mucking up the ball in some way,
Right.
you're okay. Something like spider tack is a little bit different, it seems to me, because that's something that apparently what you do is you spray it on your hand in the dugout, and then it gives you a grip. It's sort of it's a sticky grip. It's not. That's kind of like it takes place over there in the dugout or in the clubhouse, not out on the field, and that just ain't fair.
Right.
And it's the same thing with regard to some of these cheating scandals, because you've always had runners on second base, for example, or players in the dugout or on the coaching lines trying to steal signs. Personally, I don't know why that's a big deal. I think that should be basically explicitly allowed in the rules.
So you're not in the old Polo Grounds with
Well, that's different, because the Polo Grounds thing took place out in the center field clubhouse with a camera. And that was part of a problem with regard to the whole Houston cheapskate scandal, because what they were doing was using the video feed that players often resort to say, I struck out in my last at bat. What the heck did I do wrong? Right. Or for a pitcher to go take a look and say, that was a really bad inning. I want to take a look at how I was doing. You have all these video feeds, and that's apparently what Houston was doing with the trash bag caching scheme. Was they were looking at real-time video, what the catcher's signs were, and then banging the trash can, one if by fastball, two if a curveball, that kind of thing.
As we come to the end of our conversation, Brian, I know this might be a difficult question to answer, but I think it's one of those things that you might be fun. You've done a tremendous job in terms of just documenting baseball history. Okay. And I was wondering if there's any, maybe 3 historical moments that you just find fascinating, unbelievable, or just like a wow moment in terms of Major League Baseball history, looking back over all these decades.
Okay. I think one of the really interesting things is what I would call Charlie Dressen's bad day at the office, which was in the 1951 playoff game between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants, which was famously won on Bobby Thompson's home run, which he may or may not have known the pitch was coming because of the spy in the center field there. But Charlie Dressen, and this appears in the chapter in one of my earlier books, Charlie Dressen made a number of kind of very questionable decisions that day that really, I think, left me surprised that given the big lead that the Dodgers had in the middle of August, why he wasn't fired at the end of the season, because ironically he comes back and the Dodgers win the pennant in 52 and 53. And then he says, I want a multi-year contract. The owner of the Dodgers says, we ain't doing that. And he gets fired.
But I'm going to go back to my question. Okay, for Charlie Dressen. I asked you to highlight 3 important points of baseball history, and you bring out something so negative. I'm only going to give you one more question as we end the show. Give me another historical moment that's much more uplifting. Give me a walk-off moment.
For me, I think one of the most uplifting ones actually was on the day that U.S. forces got bin Laden. It was Sunday Night Baseball on ESPN, Phillies. I think the game was in Philadelphia, Phillies and Mets. And suddenly the crowd starts chanting USA, USA. And what was really impressive to me was the players looking around like, what the heck is going on? They knew something happened. They had no idea what it was. But the whole stadium got together on that day, rose to their feet. In what is kind of like, to me, I guess, the end chapter of what happened on 9/11. We finally got the guy that implemented it. To me, that was just one hell of a really terrific moment.
See, I'm going to challenge that because I read your book, and I thought the moment that you would pick out is what happened after the Boston Marathon attack and Ortiz's speech in Fenway Park.
Yeah,
that's what I.
That's
thought.
Another one, just like that.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
You're right. Well, I'm just.
They're of the same ilk there.
Okay. Well, Bryan, this has been wonderful. Bryan Soderholm-Difatte, it's just wonderful just talking to you. And I've got to get the first two books. Let's be I got to get the beginning of the encyclopedias. But I want to thank you. I want to wish you, well, and look forward to the next book that's coming, the next inning. Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.